of the School of Global and Public Affairs. It is a real privilege and it's an honor for me, but also for IE and for our school to be the hosts of this year's APSIA Dean's meeting. APSIA is the preeminent association of schools of international affairs in the world. And we have a large number of the deans of these schools coming here and spending time in Madrid the next few days. We're going to be discussing all sorts of topics on the international agenda and also their implications for higher education and international affairs. So for a few days, we're one of the places, probably the place in the world where some of these interesting discussions will be taking place, and we will all be, making decisions about how we deploy our education and our research moving forward based on those discussions. I want to thank Jim Levinson for being here and for, as president of APSIA, he's the chair, the current chair of APSIA. He's also the director of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale, soon to be the School of Global Affairs. And Jim will soon be the first holder of the deanship of the school there at Yale. So thank you, Jim, for being here and for participating in the discussion. And I want to thank Arantxa González-Laya also for being here. She comes back to us here in Spain as the dean of the School of International Studies at Sciences Po in Paris, but many of you know her. She was until recently, our foreign affairs minister and many, many other things before that. So we have this fairly unique panel with two deans from two sides of the Atlantic, and then a third dean who's hosting this, doing his best in trying to moderate actually, I'm sitting where I shouldn't be sitting. You should be here.
No, that's okay.
Is that okay? Okay. I just realized. I just wonder why am I in the middle of this? Anyway, we're good friends. So I'm sorry. So the subject of conversation is, where is the world headed? Where are international affairs headed? What are the topics that are shaping the global agenda? And how should we be thinking about these things when we think about higher education and we think about graduate studies in IR? So I'm going to launch this broad question to both Arantxa and Jim, and then the idea is that we simply open a discussion amongst us and with you as well about these topics. And it's not a boring time in global affairs. It's a very exciting time with very, very big changes. Two thrilling years. Jim was just mentioning as we were coming that our last in-person meeting, APSIA in-person meeting, was in 2020 in Paris. It was January 2020. And at the time we thought that it was very exciting and, all of these things are happening in the world. And we had no idea what we were about to live with the pandemic. Now we're in the middle of the first major land war in Europe and the first major invasion of a sovereign European democracy since the end of the Second World War. So we're seeing enormous changes in European politics, huge changes in transatlantic relations and major developments in NATO, in the future of NATO. We're about to have a NATO Summit here in Spain in June. Big questions about the role of China, by the way, on both of these issues, but particularly big open questions on the role of China when it comes to the crisis in Ukraine. So lots of things to discuss. But let me ask Arantxa and Jim, because they're the ones that are our guests today. So Arantxa, when you look at the world and you've now had this, very recent policy experience, doing a very tough time for foreign policy and for global affairs, and now you're sitting in Paris in one of the top schools of IR in the world. So you have these two points of view. Before that, you were for many years in the multilateral world, so you have a multilateral perspective on these things. What do you think are the big forces, the big events shaping global politics? So for those of us that are interested in this field, what would you say are the top things to look out for and that we should keep an eye on?
First, let me thank you for this great excuse to come back home. And it feels really nice to be back home with a different hat, but with the same convictions. And many thanks, Jim, for heading and leading APSIA, which you know, we used to think we foreign policy wonks, we used to think we were kind of boring, old, and all of a sudden we are back in the limelight, not for the right reasons though, but we are back in the limelight. Let me just try to maybe summarize what is it that we are confronting today and where I see the biggest risks. First, I would say that the international system is not that it was in a very good health a few years back. We were already having trouble. And we were having trouble essentially for three big reasons. One is geopolitics, power politics, back on the front of our screens with a big geopolitical battle between China and the United States. Number two, a changing landscape that international organizations, the governance of the international affairs having a lot of trouble adjusting to, and a third, a third factor, which was new challenges appearing on the scene with no governance mechanism on them. And this is essentially the case of technology, where governance is very scant, but the impact that governance has in international affairs is enormous. In this very big landscape, something miraculous happened back in 2015. And on hindsight, I think we were underestimating the impact that the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals had, because all of a sudden, the international community came together and agreed to some sort of compact that had values of what to protect, what to care for, what to do together, with targets, not just lofty goals, but with targets, and a commitment to meet those targets by 2030, with the idea that countries would be subjecting themselves to peer review on the way to these goals. So that was a bit of a miraculous moment looking back on history. But if I see this in 2015 and I then move forward, 2020, a COVID, a big pandemic shook our systems. The response was not exactly the best we could have hoped for, especially with the weakest, especially with the poorest, especially with those that have more trouble adjusting to the management of COVID. And by and large, we kind of muddled through COVID. But if we thought that COVID was bad, then came the invasion of Ukraine. A very gratuitous move, absolutely unacceptable, unilateral, no reason. We can add all the adjectives and adverbs that we want. But the basic truth is that that was essentially tearing down the compact that bound the international community since the Second World War. Basically, one major systemic country decided to attack its neighbor and challenge its sovereignty and territorial integrity. These two are the sacrosanct lessons that we all drew from the Second World War. This is the compact that brought the United Nations to being. So all of a sudden, this basic fundamental compact is broken. And it's been broken by, as I said, a major player, one of those that constructed the system after the Second World War. So what do I see as three big risks looking into the, moving and trying to project a little bit ourselves into the future? First, I see the risk of we here believing this is a fight between the West and the rest. This is not about the West against the rest. This is a fight between those who believe that the international system has to be based on rules, on agreements, on mechanisms, on procedures, and those who want to just simply play power politics. So I myself have abandoned the word the West, because there are many countries out there that would not feel themselves very comfortable with the idea that it's the West, because they are not geographically in the West. They are in the South, they are in the East, but they feel very strongly that they don't want to be in an international system where might is right. They don't feel that comfortable in that world. The second risk that I see is that of fragmentation. And maybe because I started my international career in international trade, this is where I see this very acutely as a danger to all countries in the international community. Fragmentation of the international community in two systems, two blocks, two norms, two rules, two concepts that would diminish growth, would diminish innovation, would diminish the opportunities to have every country advance together and leave no citizen behind. The third risk that I see is the risk that comes from weak internal democracies. The international system cannot be very healthy if countries are not healthy, because whether we like it or not, we live in a Westphalian international system. Jim knows all about this. We can't construct an international system without states, without countries. And countries that are not doing well will not construct a healthy international system. So we have to care for the solidity of our countries, for the solidity of the checks and balances and the institutions and the rules and the rights and the freedoms and the liberties that we have within our countries if we want the international system to be stronger. So, Manuel, this by means of giving you a bit of ammunition, I'm sure that you'll be, you and colleagues in the room will be shooting a little bit more later. But thanks again for this great opportunity.
Thank you, Arantxa. That's definitely food for thought, and I think many topics here that we can unpack. Jim, what's your take on this? So when we've been having a few meetings upstairs, addressing some of these things as the beginning also of a strategic reflection for APSIA. These trends are out there. How should they be also affecting the way we think about higher ed? But before I ask you about higher ed specifically, what are these major trends that you see, that are significant?
So Arantxa teed up basically a quick history of the world over the last couple of decades. The theme of almost everything you said, though, is the interconnectedness of our world, which has never been more so. You mentioned climate, if ever there was a global issue. You mentioned technology, clearly a global issue. COVID, again, has highlighted the interconnectedness of all of us. We'll talk maybe a little bit later about how that actually changes at least the way that I think about teaching and running a school of global affairs. Ukraine, you might think that the situation in Ukraine is more of the traditional international relations, geopolitics, but even that has highlighted the interconnectedness, the role it has on supply chains, on food prices, on inflation, on energy prices. Really does go throughout the entire world. We'll talk more, I hope, about Ukraine. I'm going to push back just a tiny bit, but I'm very nervous doing so with all of the expertise that is to my left, to your right. When you said, Arantxa, that many countries in the world have decided they don't want a world where, I think you used the phrase, might is right. And for sure that's true of NATO, but I think it would be perhaps a little optimistic. There's an awful lot of the world that is staying on the sidelines right now. I sat down and looked at a map. And if you look at a map of countries that really have not taken a side in what I think, and what I agree, you laid out as a very stark issue of what's right. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, much of Latin America, they're staying on the sidelines. And I think those of us from countries that have taken a very strong view probably ought to look in the mirror and ask, why is it that these countries that we thought might have been allies have been pretty silent? China, that's different. They're in a class of their own. But for many of these other countries, it's a little more surprising, to me anyway.
I'm going to actually there you go. I'm going to allow you to respond to this, but this idea, because it links to what you said about the risk of this being the West versus the rest. And I mean, there is truth to the argument that if you look at the scale of sanctions, at the, how vocal countries have been in denouncing what is happening in Ukraine and others. I mean, the most active countries have been NATO members, the US, EU members, countries that one could catalog as countries in the West. I was looking at a map, by the way, of consolidated democracies, sort of the Freedom House map, and those that have taken measures, punitive measures against Russia because of Ukraine. The overlay, the overlap is almost perfect. So this idea that, does the West exist? In fact, one of the ways in which you can answer is, well, look at the countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia, and it does look a little bit like the West. No? So my question is, do you see elements here, and we've had discussions about this in this institution, and I know many of you have been studying and reading about this thesis that the liberal international order is what's really at stake. And part of that order is international norms, international legality, almost liberal democracy is also sort of at stake. How does that connect to what we're seeing in Eastern Europe? Is this part of a broader process of erosion of that order? And how far do you think we are from avoiding this West versus the rest, which is Jim's question? Or are we really seeing just a group of countries that one would have expected would respond with consistency and strength to this, doing so, but the rest of the world decoupling from this response? And sometimes it's the silences that are very telling. The people abstaining from UN votes, the people abstaining from imposing sanctions. But how do you see that?
Well, let me say that I read in the silence many different things, not just one. I read in the silence historic links with Russia, links that have to do with the freedom struggle in some parts of the world that at that time were in a way shepherded by the Soviet Union. I see in the silence a bit of Schadenfreude. You guys are feeling the medicine that we've been feeling for a while. I see in the silence a bit of the difficult digestion that we are still regurgitating on Iraq. I see on the silence countries that are not strong enough to stand up to others, and therefore think that maybe it's easier to be outside of the reach of the, the shooting when the shooting stars. Sorry for using this, maybe not such an appropriate military term. But I see many other countries that are not in NATO and that have consistently supported every decision that has been put to a vote in the UN, whether in the UN General Assembly or in the UN Human Rights Council. So I think I see in the silence many different things, but I do see in some parts of the world a resistance to be associated with this term, the West, that they do not own. And this is why I'm saying maybe instead of talking about the West, we have to talk about a rules-based international order. Because there you have many more friends. You have many more people that are not comfortable with the idea that someone, a neighbor, or maybe a neighbor a little bit further away, will come with a pen and with the stroke of a pen, decide where the border sits or where you would have a right to take this decision or that decision. We have to help that space be stronger. At the moment, they are not feeling very comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's about liberal democracy in the sense of having a set of institutions and norms that bind everyone, and they're not just simply at the whim of the strongest in the classroom.
Jim, let me ask you something about the transatlantic response on this, because it's been, I think the US, by the way, has led in a very sophisticated way, in the sense that it has allowed Europeans to have a space to build their own response, and on many, many fronts, particularly on the economic front, the Europeans have taken a large share of the brunt of the cost of the response to the Russian invasion. But what's your assessment of how the transatlantic relationship has worked so far in the middle of this crisis? And where do you see it in the future. And I feel very tempted to ask you, this is more on the specific case of Ukraine and the past few months, but where do you see it also moving forward? Because there's a
Sure.
great deal of concern in Europe and in European capitals about the future health of the relationship if there's a change in administration in the US. Are we going to see a big shift? I mean, we've moved from an administration that really questioned the vitality and usefulness of NATO, the necessity to uphold Article 5 commitments, to an administration that is very committed to the alliance. But of course, how does that look moving forward?
Well, I think one of the unintended consequences from the Russian perspective of the invasion of Ukraine has been a strengthening of NATO. The US and European alliance is much, much stronger because of this. Some of this, maybe most of it, maybe all of it, is attributable to the change in administration. Had the events in Ukraine taken place under the previous president of the United States, the world would look, I think, very, very different today, and in a pretty awful way, to just be frank about it. I think that the events, as tragic and horrible as they are, they have brought transatlantic relations closer. What's next? Let's see how the vote in France plays out. It's not like things are absolutely unified here in Europe. We'll know more about that in a few weeks. But sadly, I think a lot will depend, the future of this relationship will depend a lot on where the elections in the United States go. It's not for another 2.5 years. But it would be naive, I think, to believe that the dysfunction that resulted from a Trump administration is clearly and always going to be in the rearview mirror. It could happen again, which is, I think, it's a cause of great concern. So I wouldn't make predictions.
But do you see the fundamental tenets of the Trump foreign policy still alive and well in the Republican Party?
Oh, I absolutely do. I think that it takes an event like what happened in Ukraine for Americans to get away from a feeling of isolation and isolationism. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Democrats and Republicans alike were pretty anti-engagement with the rest of the world. In terms of, say, China, an argument of engaging with China that might have prevailed during, say, the Obama years. Now Republicans and Democrats are pretty anti-China. So, we'll see where it goes. But the seeds that led to Trump are very, very much still there. And it would also, the United States response has been unified. But I actually suspect, and I'm sure there are opinion polls that would bear this out, most keep in mind, most Americans, meaning the majority, don't own a passport. Okay, here in Europe, very cosmopolitan, people travel, you cross borders. Most Americans don't travel. Most Americans have never left the United States. And while the response has been fairly unified, I suspect a surprising, almost depressing number of Americans don't really follow and perhaps don't really care what's going on.
There was a period at the beginning of this year, so sort of January, February, when there was just an avalanche of coverage of opinion pieces on the state of U.S. democracy. I mean, there was, there's a sort of emerging thesis that, American democracy was in the process of imploding, for a number of reasons. I mean, it was gerrymandering here, it was the process of the primaries within the Republican Party, this idea that the system cannot do well over a long period of time if one of the two parties is in this process of questioning institutional legitimacy, in various ways. It is true that there has been a pause since Ukraine. I mean, this debate has sort of gone down, and we've had, I think, much more landed discussions on how we cooperate. So this might be one of the issues that changes part of that debate. But there's structural drivers of this, particularly in the Republican Party and its base and its leadership as well.
For sure. You used the phrase a pause. And, you know, unfortunately, I think that's probably right. Back at home, I live in New Haven and teach at Yale. And the office across the hall from me is my colleague, Tim Snyder, a historian. And Tim had became a public intellectual after he wrote his book on tyranny. And we chat about this all the time. I know Tim very, very well. And I said, come on. When he first came out, I thought he was just really overplaying things. And now I think Tim's absolutely right. There's a lot of question as to the fundamental infrastructure that supports democracy at home.
This speaks to your argument about the weakening of democracy from within, because it's really very hard to imagine the international liberal order, liberal democracy doing well in the world if one of its main pillars, is actually in the process of imploding. No? And from a European point of view, I think you're going to see a lot of natural hedging against this, no? And a lot of arguments about strategic autonomy and about we need to be ready to be able to defend our values and our strategic interests, at the very least in our neighborhood, because this risk, even if it's 10, 20%, that we see this collapse or this decline in the health of the American democracy, we need to be ready for this. No? So for those of us that have studied and have worked to foster transatlantic relations over time, this is a major source of threat. And the world is very different when the US is not leading. I mean, it's just, it pops up in the oddest of places, this vacuum and this inability to forward particular, agendas and projects. So I think that, as we look, this brave new world, as we look forward, there is an enormous question mark over that future, which is the direction of US democracy. I mean, that's just big for us. And Arantxa, let me ask you a question. And by the way, I want to bring you guys on. After this, the idea is that we move into scenarios, and I want to ask you about how, how we see the conflict in Ukraine evolving. Then I'll ask a few questions about higher ed, but I really want you folks to participate because we have a lot of expertise in the room and some of our excellent faculty and students here. But Arantxa, when you look at the European response to the crisis and to the Ukraine issue, but also COVID, I mean, if you look at the last 2 years, what is your overall assessment of the European response? Is this, has the EU and European solidarity been up to par? Have we been able to respond with sufficient solidarity to the health crisis, the economic crisis, and now the security crisis? Are you optimistic about how the future of the European integration project looks, or pessimistic? What are the challenges? We do have the Macron-Le Pen, issue coming up. But
yeah, I'm more in the school of thought of Jacques Delors. He used to say, you're neither optimistic nor pessimistic, you're activistic. So that's what I think should drive us. And in this activistic mode, what I've seen in the 22 years of this century, Europe has confronted 4 major crises, 4 existential crises. First, it was the 2008 financial crisis. That was an existential crisis to the existence of the euro as a currency. And yeah, the answer was too slow, too late, but it happened. And it changed the mandate of the European Central Bank. Then came the Brexit crisis, another existential crisis because it was threatening the integration process of the European Union. And yeah, the answer was very clear. And it's not for lack of trying to divide the EU, to try and cherry pick. The answer was very clear. No, either you're in or you're out, and it's your choice. And if you choose to be out there is cold, but it's your choice. Then came a third crisis. That was the COVID. And the COVID was an existential threat to the economic and social model of Europe, because that's what the internal market is about. And the answer was, again, more Europe, mutual debt. And now came the 4th existential crisis, even tougher than the previous ones. And this is why in Europe, this is this is an issue that we leave much closer. It's much closer to our, stomach, because it's in the territory that we consider to be Europe, not European Union, Europe, and it's sovereign and territorial integrity. It's democracy, and the response has been more Europe. Yeah, okay, double down. You think we're not going to do it? Yes, we're going to do it. Security and defense, and yes, it's tough. These measures that we've taken against Putin are tough, and they can only work if they are tough. And it's tough medicine on us. Yes, but we've got to be lucid about what is it that we're trying to defend. So my basic conclusion from these 22 years of this century alone is that those who are betting against Europe will lose their money. Europe is every time capable. Yes, it's difficult because Europe is a difficult animal. It's not straightforward construction. It's much more complicated. It takes forever. It requires, and all of this is done transparently in front of the media, and sometimes with a lot of drama. But the end result is what counts, and the end result is every time that Europe is moving forward, solidifying its process and becoming more integrated. So
no, I mean, absolutely. And I remember vividly, you were in office at the time.
Yeah.
I was there, part of your team. We had this enormous sort of, issue hanging over our heads as to how Europe would respond to the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. And in the end, the response was extraordinary. We approved a fund, a recovery fund, which basically doubled the financial resources of the European Union, because it's as big almost as the multi-year financial framework of the EU. We broke the taboo of having direct transfers in the EU budget, because a large portion of the fund is direct grants into national budgets. We broke the taboo, we buried the taboo of funding this through jointly guaranteed public debt that is now being issued by what could be termed the seed of a European treasury. I don't think any of us would be using this language were we still in office, no? But this is the truth of what's behind this infrastructure. I mean, there's a real pooling of sovereign debt risk, and there's a big component of transfers. And if you look at the Ukraine crisis, exactly what you said. I mean, you could have imagined a much, much softer response on the part of the EU. We've implemented very tough sanctions jointly with the US. We've mobilized diplomatically. But I think that's a fair, it's an activist sort of perspective, but it's also, I think, optimistic. Let me ask you just quickly on scenarios, very quickly, and just landed on Ukraine. But how do you think this ends? So if you project this forward a few weeks or days or months, maybe then sooner, but how do the next few weeks look like?
You ask such easy questions. So clearly none of us know. But you asked, so I'll take a flyer. It's not days. I'm not even sure it's weeks. Typically, sides that think they are winning don't negotiate, and virtually all wars end in negotiation. So it's going to be, sadly and tragically, I personally think it may be a while still. I would predict there will probably be 3 pieces to a negotiated settlement, and I think in the end it will be a negotiated settlement. What I would predict, one piece might be a referendum in Crimea, whether they wish to formally become part of Russia or remain part of Ukraine. It's, as you know, undecided. That referendum, my read of the tea leaves is it would elect to go with Russia.
A referendum recognized by Ukraine, I mean, like a formal,
yes, yeah. As a recognized, put an end to that uncertainty. I think the second piece of a negotiated settlement would probably be again a referendum in Donbass. Again, part of Russia, part of Ukraine. I would predict there would be a lot of arguing about whether it was the entire area or a gerrymandered piece of it. If it was the entire area, again, my read of the tea leaves is it would elect to stay as part of Ukraine. And I think the third part of any negotiated settlement is going to have to be something akin to a demilitarized zone along the border so that in the future, Russia could not amass whatever, 120, 150,000 troops and claim that they were just doing exercises.
And what do, I'll ask you as well about how does this end, but I have a question for both of you, but also for Arantxa, how do, what's the future of relations with Russia? Because as this progresses, as we see more refugees, as we see more images that are, they look very clearly as war crimes, our leaders have described them as such, even acts of genocide, it becomes almost unthinkable that we would normalize relations with Russia, even if these settlements are arrived at least with the current leadership of Russia. But maybe, this hardening of the language makes a return to normality look far. But how do you think this, what's in store for us? What would you say? And it's a tough question. And by the way, Jim, thank you for the boldness and for being so specific, no? Because normally people sort of dance around these things. But how do you think that looks?
Well, this is the difficult question for Europe, because as I said, Russia is Europe, unless it wants to fall in the hands of China. China would be very pleased to do that, but Russia is essentially a European country. It's always been. The center of its history, it's in Europe. The center of its industry is in Europe. The center of its political and economic and social life has been in Europe. So what happens now? We will have a physically devastated Ukraine with lots of pain and suffering, and we will have an economically and morally devastated Russia. That's what we're looking into. The longer it takes, the more economically devastated Russia will be. Because the sanctions that have been taken, let's face it, bite. They may get a lease of life with the gas that we purchase every day, but the investments in technology that are necessary to keep the Russian economy going are not there and will not be there. And you already have to listen to Russia's central banker, Elvira Nabiullina, to understand that this will bite. So we will have a very complicated situation in Europe with a physically devastated Ukraine and an economic and morally devastated Russia that has lost the trust of Europe. Let's face it, and will take a long time to rebuild. So it's going to be tough in the European continent. And I think this is something that we have to be lucid about. Those in the European continent, and it's not just the European Union, there are many others. I can see Switzerland there, but many others in the European continent. Let's not forget Turkey in the European continent that will have to be associated to this effort at reimagining a future with Russia, certainly not with Putin, and certainly not in the short term.
I think we're very close to coming to the point where those words, not with Putin, how do we do our commonplace? Because we're sort of moving into this direction where it's a bit like it's starting to look slightly like Syria, where the regime is now so complicit in these acts that are so unpalatable and unacceptable that it becomes very difficult to imagine any normalization as long as the same people remain in power. And I think that just makes it entrenches this conflict. I think also if it continues and it becomes more indiscriminate, which seems to be the case because of the urgency on the Russian side, because of the lack of guided munitions, because of a number of factors, that the pressure to untangle even further the economic interdependence that we have with Russia, the pressure goes up. And I'd be very surprised if this war continues for weeks and months, that the sanctions are not extended fully into oil and gas and others, despite the cost that entails for countries, particularly in Europe. So what we're witnessing is the unraveling of our relationship with Russia because of Russia's behavior towards Ukraine. And that there's a structural dimension to this that will be very hard to undo. So, I think this is going to clearly be one of the big topics. A quick final round of questions, and then it's over to the Q&A. So please, guys, think of things that you want to pose. And we've spoken very little about China, by the way, and other things, but and very little about the global economy. I'm sure there'll be maybe a question on that as well, because it's full of mysteries at the moment, and we're seeing a big change in monetary policy and the geopolitical implications to these things. But a question on higher education, just a sort of a brush to give the issue some color. So both of you, you're sitting at the top of these very important institutions in international affairs and in global politics. A lot of the future leaders of the world are coming through your classrooms. You get to hire and you get to take care of very, important faculty and people that are generating knowledge. How does this world affect how you think about your obligations, your mission, and how you go about fulfilling it?
It heightens the importance of our mission. I mean, if ever there were a set of events that highlight how important it is to train the next generation, we're living them. Current events have also, though, changed the way that I'm starting working with my colleagues to start a new school. And current events have changed the way I think about organizing a new school. For some 600 years, we've organized universities around departments. I didn't look at the sign at the bottom of the stairs, but I would not be stunned if there was a department of economics, a department of politics, a department of so-and-so. And I think it's time to start to organize schools around problems. If you think of departments as being silos, and they often don't talk to each other despite the lingo of interdisciplinarity, you've got these horizontals. Arantxa mentioned a bunch of them. Climate hits all of them. Technology hits all of them. COVID hits all of them. I think that as we train the next generation, we should start thinking in terms of problems, not departments.
Yeah, I was mentioning this to Jim, and Arantxa was referring also our experience during our time at the Foreign Ministry. We crafted an external action strategy that was also very focused on these transversal topics. So trying to move away from the verticals of departments, in the case of diplomacy, from the verticals of geography, which is our normal. If you look at the structure of foreign ministries around the world, if you look at where their muscle, both intellectual and physical, is basically around Africa, Latin America, Asia, this, that. But these topics that are transversal, they're real challenges. And sometimes we don't have the intellectual or the capacity, the administrative capacity to tackle them. Global economics, health, climate, technology, rights, human rights and political order. These things, they're a challenge for our universities, and they're a big challenge for our foreign services and our diplomats around the world, because they're the emerging fields in global politics. And a lot of our students, I referred to when I was speaking to Jim, and I mentioned this to Carmen, our director at APSIA, that when I was looking at data from APSIA schools a few years back, it very clearly showed that regional studies had gone down across the world. So less and less students were interested in studying African studies, European studies, or Latin American studies. Except China studies that had gone up, the rest were going down. People, particularly young people, but there are many in the room, so you tell us later whether this is true, are far more interested in learning about how do we govern and reverse climate change? How do we govern emerging technologies, social media, AI, the implications of AI and outer space, and what are the implications of the metaverse? I mean, and these are challenge-driven people that want to go out and affect these things. But how do you think, and you've been there for a few months.
You've described my first month in in my new job. Is exactly right. I mean, maybe what's interesting in my case is that I've been a practitioner on the other side. So, I mean, I can see whether or not what is being offered meets the demand that I felt I had when I was a minister. But I would say there are three things that I like, that I think we need to respond to. First is the management of our interdependence. You mentioned it, Jim. Our interconnectedness. How do we manage that? The second is resilience. How do we build this resilience? This is not easy, because no one tells you how to build resilience. The third dimension that I think we need to be better at is values. We've abandoned values. We teach interests. But what about values? Where are the humanities in all of this? So that part also needs to be embedded into the way we teach, because solving these problems starts with understanding that you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other person you have in front of you if you want this to be resolved.
Yeah, I think both of you actually raised something very interesting. No, your applied experience in government and this issue of challenges, this idea that the way we think about the function of our schools needs to be very driven by the real world, by real world challenges, and then you build backwards. And as professional schools, I think that makes preeminent sense rather than being driven by departmental drivers and sort of internal structural conditioning factors of this. No? But let me open it up to questions, and free and open questions you can ask anybody in the audience, anything you want to, any questions, any complaints, you've all been given a piece of fruit or vegetable that you can throw. I think do we have a mic? We have a mic somewhere. Who's the first brave to break the ice? There's somebody in the back there, somebody there.
Hi, thank you for your time, firstly. Secondly, I think on a personal level, I think it's very interesting you were talking about the US citizens not having passports and that being a reason why they don't travel and don't really engage with the outside world. And I think India is very similar, if not from documentation, but from the financial difficulties that they have. And I think propaganda is a huge risk for the global community right now, because India at the moment is owned, 85% of the national media is owned by Narendra Modi. And he's the prime minister, so I think that's a very worrying aspect to think about. But on the on an international holistic level, I have a question to ask you about your transatlantic relations. I personally believe that there have been two economic power blocks forming on top of the political power blocks that already exist. And I think that's a bit of a risk, because as I think it was said earlier, that if all the countries that impose sanctions were put on a map, it would be mostly the West. I think since Crimea, since US interactions in the Middle East in the last 20 years, I think we're seeing the resurgence of a Cold War. I don't think it ever really went away. It was simply hibernating for a while, let's say, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think now we're seeing Putin go back to, because he's also had nuclear silos built in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan. He's understanding the side of the world that is on his side and who he can manipulate to be on his side. And I think the US is doing the same. The US is by no means, in this case, yes, of course. In the case of Ukraine, of course, the US is the person we look to. But in the Middle East, the US is not. In Latin America, the US is not. So I think there is, while you're saying there is an improvement of transatlantic relations, I think there is a resurgence of the dual hegemonic system, which is more worrying than transatlantic relations, because we're seeing two clear blocks being formed. So what do you think about
do you mind sharing your name and
my name is Kabir. I'm a second-year student at BBA-BIR. Thank you.
BBA-BIR is our business bachelor's in IR. We have all of these acronyms. I think that's a very, very interesting question on blocks. And I mean, are we headed into this sort of G2 world, broken world? I assume you mean sort of a China-led, maybe China-Russia-led, and then a US Western-led. Is that, yeah?
You know, you've got two people here who have spent parts of their careers in foreign ministries, and you're asking the academic. So you really should be asking that of my colleagues here. You mentioned the world is turning into two economic blocks. I assume you mean basically the West/United States and China. I hope that might be right, and I hope it's wrong. I mean, the tool that we've used against Ukraine has been sanctions. And it's worth keeping in mind, sanctions don't work if you don't have trade in the beginning that you can then withdraw.
Right.
Okay, and if we see say the United States and China separate from each other, and suppose China were to do something in Taiwan, okay, it would be really nice, again, to have the economic tools to respond as opposed to more conventional war. So are we moving toward those divergent blocks? That does seem to be the general trend, but I sure hope it doesn't go too far. But again, the real expertise is here to my left.
Two quick observations before I answer. One is, I think something interesting to look into is whether, I mean, this shock and awe campaign of economic sanctions will erode the tool of economic sanctions in the future, because one of the most hard-hitting measures that we've taken was to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank.
Mhm.
And I can assure you, there are many central banks around the world looking at this and saying, well, actually, this is a source of exposure and risk moving forward. But to what Jim is saying, which is far more structural, I think we lived in a world where, particularly regarding Russia, I think it's an open question when it comes to China, where the central thesis was, we're going to build this interdependence because that's going to make conflict unthinkable. And eventually also, I think there was a hope in some circles that it would also produce economic convergence, would produce political convergence. So we would see a much more open, liberal, maybe some people thought democratic world if we integrated economically. So, you know, you would never go to war with a country with a McDonald's and things like that, no? And this was sort of the overarching thesis. And with Russia, if that system has now allowed for a country that was part of it to take action of the nature that we're seeing, just a full-on, you know, departure from the UN Charter and from international law, then of course the pressure is to undo that interdependence because it's not serving its purpose, right? So I think we're sort of living this tectonic shift in how we think, and that's moving us in the direction of what you're referring to. I think the bigger question, I'll be very curious to know your opinion on this. The bigger question is, what is China going to do? Because if China aligns itself much more clearly with Russia, enables Russia to avoid part of these sanctions and others, then I think that takes us much, much closer to a world of blocks. If it doesn't, I think we might be looking at a very, not you know, particularly isolated Russian and Putin issue. So what happens in the next few weeks will be extremely revealing in my mind, but I don't know your take on this.
So Russia is not China. We are dependent from Russia on energy and raw materials, and we are interdependent with China, meaning China needs us as much as we need China. It's not the case with Russia, which is probably why what's happening is happening. Because probably in the mind of Vladimir Putin, the dependence that he thought we had from Russia, he had a higher coefficient than we've ended up accepting we had. So I would not put China and Russia in the same basket. Do we have, and I would be very cautious about saying, well, you know, we have to deplug oil and gas from Russia. And by the way, we also have to deplug from China. That's a different proposition. Russia in the world economy is the size of the Italian economy. That's Russia. And if you look at what it exports, 2/3 of what it exports is energy or processed energy. That's it. This is not China. So let's look at the figures first. Second, I would say China will always play for China. China will not play for Russia. China will play for China. So what is good for China? The signals they are sending us is that it pays off internally to be a bit anti-West. It mobilizes public support. So we will see a little bit of that, especially in the run-up to a party congress where the leader wants to change the rules that have always governed leadership. That always helps. So we'll see a bit of that. But on the economic side, I think what we've seen up until now is a lot of caution. Now, why are we seeing caution? Because European sanctions do not have an extraterritorial impact, but American sanctions have an extraterritorial impact. Meaning, if a Chinese company helps a Russian company get around the sanctions, that Chinese company will be penalized. And that is a different proposition. So what we've seen up until now is a lot of caution on the side of the Chinese companies to embark into circumventing sanctions that US or Europe have imposed. So my prediction, but you will help me accountable to that in the next session you invite me to, is that we will not see China helping Russia circumvent its sanctions, nor will we see China mediating in this conflict. We will see a China playing for China in a very, very rational way. The Chinese are the ultimate rationalists in this story.
I find that to be a very positive scenario. It's one, I mean, it takes us a little bit further away from the bloc's idea, but we're going to find out. I mean,
let me warn against fragmentation, because there may be a temptation. And the temptation may be on both sides to say, let's make sure that the international norms are only for people like us. And then the others, they can develop their own norms. That is what we have to be careful about. And we have to be as careful as the Chinese or the Russians. We also, because when you are an economy the size of the US or the size of the EU, and when you have the global ambitions that we have, our ambition should be to reinvent an international order where everybody fits. Now, we have to make sure that that order reflects the values that we want that international order to reflect. But our ambition should be that everybody fits there, because that's what's best for us and for everyone, in our view.
That's why she was the foreign minister here.
Yeah.
A question here. The microphone is coming.
Thank you very much. Evan Treseno from Swiss Embassy. I have a question. You talked a lot about values, about international norms and so on. And you also mentioned that this international legal system was one of the sources of the stability in Europe since World War II. Now, my question is, did that stability come from those values, from this multilateral-based system, or was it the bipolar order that reigned during that time? And do we now see the ripples of that bipolar order collapsing and are now in this not really multipolar, not really unipolar, not really bipolar system, and therefore are in this transitionary brave new world in that sense?
God, Jim should answer this question,
No.
because that's a brainy, but I would say that the system up until now worked for two reasons. One, because there was a hegemon, and that hegemon in a way was the one that was watching to make sure that the system would work, but also because there was a self-restraint on the part of all members of the community. And when there was someone that did not behave in a way, by and large, it became a pariah. Sorry, to caricaturize, maybe it's not too elegant, but since I'm not the foreign minister any longer, I think I can be a bit more loose in my language. That's what has helped. These two things, these two ingredients have helped the system held together. Now, we now have a situation where the old hegemon has doubts about whether it wants to continue to be the hegemon, probably because it's feeling uncomfortable also domestically to continue to be hegemon. And that's a problem for all of us, because we now don't have a hegemon, or maybe we're looking at a hegemon that we would not feel very comfortable with. And this idea that there are multiple hegemons, for now, it's not clear. So yeah, we are in that transition phase. And yeah, this is why, as European, but committed to a well-functioning international system, I want Europe to have the ability to act, even when there is no hegemon. Because I don't want to be in a situation where I'm preventing from moving if someone is not taking care of me.
In terms of power structure, I mean, if you look at the distribution of economic weight across the world over centuries, A lot of people say that what we're witnessing is not the rise of China, but in fact the return of China, because China was about a quarter of the global GDP for 18 of the past 20 centuries, right? So for them, the past 2 centuries were, a bit of an oddity, but it's a real shift of a centuries-long reality, which was very West Atlantic centric, Europe, and then Atlantic centric global economy and global power distribution. The US, another figure that really struck me was the US had not had, since the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, a competitor that had a GDP larger than 40% that of the US. So the Soviet Union never had an economy that was larger than that. Japan never had an economy that was larger than that. The China's is well over that figure. So, I mean, just the challenge that this poses economically, strategically, this trickles down to the military challenge is completely different. So there's a real change to the structure of the distribution of power that we're seeing. And there are underpinning elements to this of political system, of values, of views on the international order. And this is all playing before our eyes. And I think, and this connects to the conversation that comments that Jim was making before, that this is accelerated by developments within the US itself. But I think we're going to look back, and this unipolar moment that we lived from the end of the Second World War, but particularly after the end of the Cold War, is going to look like a real historical oddity over time. My thesis is that we're going to miss it, but I'm very Atlanticist.
I think we already do.
Yeah, I think we already do, because hegemony brings with it enormous responsibilities. There's this thesis, it's called the Kindleberger trap. This idea that when you have a major power, it's a huge provider of global public goods. What Arantxa was saying, it provides for the safety of sea lanes, it helps upkeep the international legal architecture, it enforces security, and that's ending. And the trap is that what happens in a situation where you have a power that's emerging, but it's yet unwilling to take on some of these responsibilities, or simply does not wish to take them on, right? We have 5 minutes, so if there's any, there's a question, so we'll collect these two. Any more questions there? No? Okay.
Working, yes. Thank you very much. My name is Vyacheslav Tudakov, National University of Odessa Law Academy, Ukraine. That's why, unfortunately, I was at the center of this tragical events in my country. That's why I have, well, my question is not connected with economy, and the economic sanction as usual, which are discussed in the European context, why Ukraine and why Russia. The case is that I have one very small question as a public lawyer as a whole. Who will prosecute Putin? The case is that due to international order, since Nuremberg trial, we have no specific mechanism to prosecute genocide from Putin and his allies. Moscow has not signed, well, the ICC Statute of the Rome Statute, the same will do by Ukraine, but we have the possibility to ICC to work under our territory due to degrees of our government. From the other point of view, you know that there is not only the break of law, but there is misuse of law. It's very simple, up to my mind, to, well, we have in the history of an example of Greece, when they excluded themselves from European Convention of Human Rights. The same was done by Russia in 2014. Exactly when they say, well, we use the convention, but we'll try to minimize it because of some processes which are connected with the constitutional justice in Russian Federation. And that's why, for example, when they now excluded themselves from European Convention of Human Rights, what should we do with them? What should we do with the possibility of creating of international tribunal for Putin's crimes? because of there is always a question, because Russia is the member after the Soviet Union in the United Nations Security Council with the writing of veto. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me collect the very last one here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you.
It takes some time for some.
Hello? Now.
Yeah, it's better for
Thank
the
you.
online.
Thank you very much for a very insightful panel. Angel Alonso, I work here at the School of Global and Public Affairs as Vice Dean with Manuel. My question follows up on the previous two ones somehow, and is related to your assessment on the current state of multilateralism and the international order. Arantxa, you mentioned 2015, that magic year of hope, SDGs, the climate agreement in Paris, the work that we did at the OECD, for instance, on international taxation. Then we had a rough second half of the past decade, Trump, Brexit, you were mentioning them as well. I think in 2020, when we were at the ministry, we also saw a glimpse of hope in terms of how the shock that we live, as a global community with COVID could give hope in terms of reinforced multilateral cooperation. I think that hope was somehow not necessarily follow up in terms of what we have seen at the international order. We didn't see any reorganization like we saw after 2008 with the emergence of the G20. In the current crisis in Ukraine, for instance, the UN is, I will be mild on this, but almost missing in action in the current system. I share the assessment about what the progress that we have seen in Europe. But again, we are seeing, for instance, that Europe is deciding to play more by the rules of power. Nothing against that. I think in that hope of being an hegemon for good, the EU is right. But at the same time, we are not seeing necessarily a force of reinventing the multilateral order, and we are going more towards the whole Hobbesian wall of power politics. So my question is, how do you assess the current moment for multilateralism, the United Nations systems, the Bretton Woods system, and what is your view on what we might see next?
Actually, this is both somewhat connected because, how do we prosecute this is also a question about the multilateral order and international law, the future of multilateralism, and then we'll close. If you have a quick recommendation for our students, what should they be thinking about? What should they do with their lives, because they don't get to see you every day. They're stuck with us after you leave. So some wisdom from your experience and from your schools. But Arantxa, maybe you go first. And then Jim.
Yeah, essentially what I would say the biggest difficulty we have on the international scene is that the international system is a Westphalian system, centered on countries, governments, nations. And if the nations don't want to, the international system doesn't work. I mean, we can say it's all the fault of Antonio Guterres, but he's got a member sitting in the Security Council called Russia. He does not let any decision pass. So I think it would be good as a student to take more interest in something that my former boss, Pascal Lamy, calls polylateralism. Meaning a lot of issues we have to deal with are not only the domain of governments or nations. They are the domain of businesses, civil society, activists. Climate change is a good example. Yes, Donald Trump moved the US out of the climate change accord, but yes, lots of mayors doubled down, lots of businesses doubled down, lots of citizens tripled down and said, this guy, he can do what he wants, but look, we will continue to reduce CO2, we will abate CO2, we will take measures to mitigate, we will spend our money in third countries to help them reduce. So maybe the part that we have to explore, yes, we have to push our governments as citizens that we also are, push our governments to spend more energy into reforming the existing system, reinventing the international system, but we also have to look at where are there spaces for other than governments to take action. I can tell you the pressure on governments from civil society on climate change, on taxation, is what allows a lot of governments, actually, what obliges a lot of governments to move.
I could not agree more. On the question about multilateralism, let's not forget, though, that NATO is playing a pretty big role. here in a hugely important role, and that is inherently a multilateral institution. So I wouldn't write off multilateralism altogether just because Russia has a veto in the Security Council. And to the question of what happens to Mr. Putin, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think anybody knows. I mean, at the moment, I think the challenge is to stop him, to make this so costly that he's forced to stop and to negotiate and to help Ukraine both during the conflict and after. But it's going to be a major looming question over the resolution of this, I think, as we move forward. But it's a tough question. I don't think there's a clear answer to the question. But I want to leave it here. I want to be very respectful of everybody's time. I want to thank both of you, Arantxa and Jim, for being here, all of you for attending. We are living very interesting times, and that means a lot of open questions, a lot of uncertainty about how the world is going to look. I want to echo what Jim said. It also means that the study of international relations, of international politics, of security, of international economics becomes ever more central for our governments, for our corporations, and for our citizens in general to be able to navigate the uncertainty of whatever they're doing and of life. So I hope that we continue to serve our purpose of training people, of creating knowledge, and of convening these sorts of discussions and debates. So thank you for being a part of this and for sharing your ideas. And thank you, everybody, and have a good end of the day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perdona que me he sentado en tu sitio sin ningún tipo de pudor.
My mind, she will head probably hopefully to the United Nations Security Council, and she's on your, she belongs